The courtroom was tense, electric with anticipation, as the world watched one of the most shocking royal confrontations in decades unfold. Queen Camilla, the woman who had ascended to the highest echelons of British royalty with careful calculation and relentless ambition, sat in the defendant's chair, her composure crumbling before the eyes of the world. For years, whispers had swirled around the tragic death of Princess Diana, rumors that the royal establishment had been entangled in deception, but nothing had prepared the public for this moment. Prince Edward, the youngest son of Queen Elizabeth, was revealing details so explosive, so unthinkable, that they threatened to rewrite the narrative of one of the most infamous nights in modern history. It was the night of August 31st, 1997, when the world lost Diana, the people's princess. Paris was shrouded in darkness, and the streets pulsed with a chaos that mirrored the media frenzy stalking every move of the royal family. Paparazzi cameras flashed relentlessly, engines roared, and the city became a stage for a tragedy that would haunt generations. For decades, the official story had centered on a chase gone wrong, reckless drivers, and an overzealous media, but now, Edward was claiming that it was not chance, not fate, that had led to Diana's death. It was deception, calculated, deliberate, and orchestrated from within the very walls of the royal family. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Camilla's face, framed by subtle wrinkles of tension and eyes that darted nervously around the courtroom, betrayed a vulnerability rarely seen in public. The woman who had weathered decades of public scrutiny, who had risen from an outsider to a queen consort, now faced the most intimate and damning accusations of her life. Edward's voice, firm yet laced with unmistakable grief, resonated through the chamber as he outlined what he alleged to be undeniable proof that Camilla had coordinated with the paparazzi on that fateful night, feeding them Diana's whereabouts, ensuring that every step the princess took was captured, monitored, and ultimately exploited. The shock of the accusation rippled through the courtroom. Journalists leaned forward, pens poised over notebooks, and television cameras whirred silently, capturing the raw human drama of the moment. The public, tuning in from across the globe, struggled to reconcile the image of Camilla, the quiet, dignified presence beside King Charles, with the narrative Edward painted, a woman whose ambition and desire for power might have intersected fatally with a night that already carried the weight of tragedy. As Edward presented his evidence, each document, photograph, and testimony seemed to pull back the veil of secrecy that had protected the monarchy for decades. The very thought that someone within the family could manipulate the media to track Diana was almost too shocking to process. And yet, the meticulous way in which Edward laid out his claims left no room for doubt in the minds of those in the courtroom. This was not mere conjecture or bitter family gossip. This was presented as carefully corroborated evidence, meant to expose a betrayal that, if true, was unprecedented in its audacity and impact. For years, Diana's death had been surrounded by speculation, conspiracy theories, and endless commentary from pundits, royal biographers, and the public. Every angle had been analyzed: the reckless driver, the dangerous high-speed chase, the role of Henri Paul, the intoxicated security officer, and the unforgiving glare of relentless cameras. But now, with Edward's revelations, a new dimension was added: the possibility that the tragedy had been exacerbated by someone close to the crown, someone whose motives may have been deeply personal, intertwined with jealousy, resentment, or a desire to manipulate circumstance for their advantage. Camilla's reactions, captured in close-ups by the cameras, told a story of a woman cornered. Her eyes, often shielded by composed facades during public appearances, now flickered with panic and disbelief. Her lips trembled, and at one point, she buried her face in her hands, unable to withstand the weight of Edward's relentless presentation. There was a sense of immediacy and emotional gravity that reminded everyone that these were not distant historical events being dissected for curiosity. They were moments of real human consequence, moments that shaped lives, reputations, and histories. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath as Edward spoke not only with precision, but with an undercurrent of personal anguish. He recounted the timeline of that night with painstaking detail, The movement of Diana and her companions, the flashes of cameras that chased her through the streets, the near collisions, and the sudden, irreversible accident at the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. Each step was linked to the claim that Camilla had knowingly provided information to the paparazzi, turning what might have been a manageable evening into a night of escalating danger. Questions arose in every mind present. Why would anyone, especially a member of the royal family, risk the life of a beloved public figure? What motives could possibly justify or explain such actions? Edward hinted at a complex tapestry of emotions and ambitions. Perhaps envy, perhaps fear of Diana's enduring popularity, perhaps a desire to cement his own influence within the royal hierarchy. The courtroom was not just a setting for legal proceedings. It had become a stage for the ultimate revelation of human complexity, the collision of power, ambition, and tragedy. The public's fascination with Diana had never waned. Her charm, grace, and activism had captivated hearts worldwide, and her death had created a vacuum of mourning that had lasted decades. Camilla's relationship with Charles, and the perception of her as a rival in Diana's life, had long fueled speculation, but Edward's courtroom disclosure added a new, unnerving layer to this narrative. It was as though the past, long buried beneath layers of royal protocol and public diplomacy, was erupting into the present, demanding reckoning. Outside the courtroom, social media buzzed with reactions ranging from shock to disbelief. News outlets scrambled to cover every revelation, analyzing video snippets, dissecting facial expressions, and debating the potential implications for the monarchy. Across London, Paris, and the world, viewers were glued to screens, caught between empathy for the royal family's internal strife and fascination with the unfolding scandal. The night that had taken Diana's life now resurfaced not as a distant tragedy, but as an active, emotional battleground where secrets were being laid bare in the harsh light of scrutiny. Edward's narrative also touched on the human cost of ambition and secrecy. He reminded the audience, indirectly but powerfully, that behind the grandeur of royal titles and palaces, the members of the family were human, vulnerable, capable of mistakes, and occasionally capable of actions with consequences beyond their comprehension. Camilla's presence in the courtroom, her visible distress, underscored this reality. This was not a story about abstract power. It was a story about real people, real decisions, and the haunting consequences that could ripple through time. The introduction to this drama set the stage for a story that promised not only shocking allegations, but deep emotional resonance. Every revelation, every tear, and every hesitant glance between the family members carried with it the weight of history and the fragility of reputation. The audience was being invited into a narrative that was part investigative exposé, part emotional human story, and part royal history lesson, all intertwined in a way that demanded attention, reflection, and emotional investment. As the courtroom proceedings continued, the tension between past and present became palpable. The ghosts of Diana's final hours seemed to linger in the room, amplified by Edward's deliberate recounting of events and Camilla's visible struggle to maintain composure. It was a reminder that the monarchy, often perceived as untouchable and impervious, was in fact a fragile institution, dependent on the choices, loyalties, and sometimes the missteps of its members. In the coming sections, viewers would witness an unraveling of secrets that had been carefully guarded for decades. They would see Edward's relentless pursuit of truth collide with Camilla's determination to protect her reputation. They would experience the mounting public scrutiny and the re-examination of events long thought settled. And through it all, the emotional core of the story, the grief, the betrayal, the longing for accountability, would remain inescapable, compelling viewers to confront not only the narrative being presented, but their own perceptions of justice, loyalty, and consequence. The introduction closes with a sense of looming revelation. The courtroom drama is only beginning, and the world is poised to watch as layers of secrecy are peeled back, exposing the human complexity and moral ambiguities at the heart of one of the most enduring royal tragedies. Viewers are left with a question that will echo throughout the story. How far can ambition go, and what price is paid when power intersects with personal vendetta? The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the historic courtroom, casting long shadows across polished oak floors and gilded benches. It was a room that had seen countless cases, a space that carried the weight of history in its walls, yet nothing in its storied past could have prepared the world for what was about to unfold. The buzz of anticipation was almost tangible. Journalists, legal experts, royal aides, and even members of the public had gathered, all drawn by the gravity of a story that promised scandal, heartbreak, and revelation in equal measure. Cameras clicked, pens scratched across notebooks, and whispers fluttered through the air like nervous birds. Every eye was fixed on the entrance, waiting for the arrival of the figures who had come to define a drama that had captivated the globe for decades. Queen Camilla entered first, her presence measured and deliberate. She walked with the poise of a woman accustomed to the relentless gaze of the world, her posture impeccable, her expression carefully neutral. Yet, there was something in her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, a trace of fear, that betrayed the anxiety bubbling beneath her composed exterior. For years, she had mastered the art of appearing unshakable, of weathering scrutiny with grace and dignity. But today, under the harsh glare of the courtroom lights and the piercing focus of the public, those defenses were strained to their limit. Her entrance was quiet but commanding, a reminder that she was no ordinary figure in this unfolding saga. Moments later, Prince Edward appeared, his demeanor a stark contrast to Camilla's practiced composure. He moved with an urgency that suggested more than just the formality of legal proceedings. He carried with him the weight of decades of unanswered questions, suppressed truths, and the emotional toll of witnessing tragedy from the periphery of the royal narrative. His gaze swept across the courtroom, acknowledging the press with a brief nod, but quickly returning to the documents in his hands, meticulously organized, each piece of evidence a calculated move in a game that had been decades in the making. The tension in the room thickened as he approached the podium, the gravity of his mission evident in the deliberate pace of his steps. The opening moments of the session were charged with electricity. Edward's first words cut through the murmurs like a blade, firm yet infused with emotion, setting the tone for the revelations to come. He spoke of Diana, not as a distant figure of history, not as the icon of charity and grace the world remembered, but as a human being whose life had been subjected to forces beyond her control. He reminded the courtroom, in measured tones that betrayed a barely contained grief, that behind the fairy tale veneer of the royal family were real people, with real vulnerabilities, capable of both profound love and, as he suggested, devastating misjudgment. As Edward laid out the sequence of events from that infamous night in Paris, the courtroom hung on every word. He described, with painstaking detail, the movements of Diana and her companions, the sudden flares of camera flashes, and the cacophony of engines that had made the streets of Paris a perilous arena. Each description was accompanied by references to documents, notes, and testimony that painted a picture of meticulous observation, of a night that was, in Edward's assertion, manipulated with precision. He suggested that Camilla, leveraging her connections and knowledge, had fed the paparazzi critical information, enabling them to track Diana's movements with unnerving accuracy. The crowd reacted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Journalists exchanged glances, their pens pausing mid-scribble, while members of the public leaned forward, caught between disbelief and the morbid fascination of witnessing a historical narrative upended in real time. The suggestion that a member of the royal family could have orchestrated such surveillance on a beloved princess was almost beyond comprehension, yet Edward's methodical presentation lent a gravity to his claims that was difficult to dismiss. It was a reminder that the line between rumor and revelation could be perilously thin, and that the truth, when finally exposed, often carried consequences far heavier than anyone anticipated. Camilla's reactions were telling. At first, her composure remained, the faintest hint of tension appearing only in the slight tightening of her jaw and the occasional darting glance toward her counsel. But as Edward's words dug deeper, her facade began to crack. The subtle tremor in her hands, the blink that seemed to betray a flicker of panic, and the near imperceptible swallow that accompanied the weight of the allegations all signaled a woman grappling with the enormity of what was being unveiled. The camera lenses, ever intrusive, captured each micro-expression, each hint of vulnerability, creating an image of a royal figure suddenly exposed in ways she had never anticipated. Edward continued, shifting from the macro narrative of Diana's movements to the micro details that made his case compelling. He referenced intercepted communications, travel logs, and photographic evidence that suggested an unprecedented level of coordination between Camilla and media operatives. Each piece of information was presented not merely as accusation, but as part of a carefully constructed argument, building a narrative of intentionality that framed Diana's fatal journey as more than a tragic accident. It was, in Edward's depiction, a chain of events that had been influenced, perhaps even catalyzed, by choices made behind closed doors. The courtroom itself seemed to respond to the tension, as if the walls, heavy with centuries of history, were aware of the magnitude of the moment. Lawyers adjusted their positions, whispering quietly to clients or colleagues, while the public and press alike remained rapt, the air thick with anticipation. Every gesture, every pause, every sigh was magnified, contributing to an atmosphere that was at once suffocating and magnetic. It was a setting where history, emotion, and spectacle collided, producing a tableau that was impossible to ignore. Edward's presentation was interspersed with poignant questions directed at the courtroom, questions designed to provoke thought, reflection, and, in some cases, moral reckoning. What would it mean if someone close to the crown had the power to influence a night that ended in tragedy? He asked, his voice steady but charged with intensity. How do we reconcile ambition and loyalty when the stakes involve the life of a human being? These rhetorical provocations were not idle. They forced the audience to engage with the narrative on a deeper level, bridging the gap between scandalous revelation and the universal human experience of loss, betrayal, and accountability. Camilla's counsel attempted to intervene, presenting formal objections and procedural arguments. Yet even these interruptions could not diminish the growing sense of drama. The weight of Edward's evidence and the emotional resonance of his delivery created a momentum that was difficult to counter. Every rebuttal, every attempt at deflection, was met with further evidence, more pointed questions, and a courtroom increasingly attuned to the human dimension of the unfolding saga. As the morning progressed, the tension reached new heights. Edward's recounting of the paparazzi's pursuit was vivid, almost cinematic, capturing the chaotic energy of the Paris streets and the relentless flash of cameras that had hounded Diana at every turn. He detailed how specific pieces of information had likely been provided to photographers, allowing them to anticipate movements, capture key moments, and contribute, indirectly or directly, to the circumstances that led to the accident. It was a chilling reconstruction, one that left the audience grappling with the uncomfortable possibility that what had long been attributed to chance might have been influenced by deliberate human action. The chapter concluded with a moment of silence, a pause heavy with implication. Camilla sat motionless, her hands clasped in front of her, a fragile barrier against the storm of revelation. Edward, standing with a quiet confidence born of preparation and purpose, allowed the weight of his words to settle before the room erupted into controlled murmurs, the first signs of discussion, debate, and speculation that would inevitably spill beyond the courtroom walls. The stage was set, the narrative arc established, and the world had been given its first glimpse into a story that promised not only scandal and intrigue, but profound emotional resonance. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted as the session resumed after a brief recess. The earlier tension now transformed into a collective anticipation of the revelations to come. Edward approached the central table with a deliberate calm, carrying a stack of meticulously organized files, photographs, and printed correspondence, each document representing a fragment of a story that had long remained buried. The significance of what was about to be revealed was palpable, and every person present seemed to sense that history was unfolding before them. Murmurs died down as cameras adjusted, and the courtroom's focus fell squarely on Edward, who looked over the gathered audience with a steady gaze, as if inviting them into the secret narrative he was about to expose. He began with the first set of evidence, photographs, time-stamped and meticulously labeled, capturing Diana in moments that appeared ordinary at first glance but, when examined closely, revealed patterns of surveillance that were anything but coincidental. Edward guided the audience through each image, highlighting subtle but telling details. A reflection in a shop window showing a photographer crouched behind a barricade, a shadow cast in the corner of a street, a license plate caught in the glow of a passing street lamp. Each frame told a story, a testament to the painstaking attention of those who had tracked Diana's movements with unnerving precision. Edward's voice was measured but carried the emotional weight of someone recounting the surveillance of a loved one, turning cold facts into a narrative that was both compelling and devastating. Next came intercepted communications, messages and emails between media operatives and sources within the royal circle, documents Edward presented with the solemnity of someone handling artifacts of a deeply personal history. The content suggested a flow of information that was carefully curated, passed along through channels designed to maintain secrecy, yet ensure maximum exposure. Locations, schedules, and intentions, all seemingly mundane, were presented as part of a coordinated strategy, painting a picture of a night in Paris where every movement of Diana's was anticipated. Edward paused frequently, allowing the courtroom to absorb the implications, the silence stretching long enough to weigh heavily on the gathered crowd. He moved on to travel logs, the meticulously recorded entries that charted the movements of vehicles, personnel, and even air traffic in the vicinity of Diana's route. Edward pointed to inconsistencies and correlations that suggested foreknowledge, aligning the movements of photographers with Diana's exact itinerary. The careful orchestration, he argued, was not merely coincidence but a product of deliberate planning. He asked pointed questions to the court, not seeking immediate answers, but compelling the audience to consider the depth of orchestration required to anticipate every step of Diana's night. If these movements were coincidental, he posed, why do they align so precisely with the moments that proved pivotal? The narrative shifted as Edward introduced audio recordings, some of them short snippets of conversations captured between individuals who had access to Diana's schedule. The content was innocuous at first, discussions about logistics and timings, but in context, Edward suggested they revealed more, a framework through which knowledge of Diana's whereabouts had been systematically funneled to those poised to capture every detail. He played each snippet deliberately, pausing to emphasize key phrases, guiding the courtroom through the nuances that transformed ordinary chatter into a narrative of calculated oversight. The emotional effect was immediate. Some listeners flinched at the implications, while others leaned forward, straining to catch the subtle inflections that gave weight to Edward's claims. Edward's presentation was interwoven with references to historical context, reminding the audience that the media frenzy surrounding Diana had not occurred in a vacuum. He detailed the intense scrutiny the princess endured, the global obsession with her movements, and the relentless pressure applied by photographers whose sole purpose was to capture the unguarded moments of her life. By situating the evidence within this broader framework, Edward conveyed the stakes involved, not only the dangers posed by reckless pursuit, but also the human cost of an orchestrated surveillance campaign. His argument was not abstract. It was grounded in the lived experience of someone intimately connected to the events, a perspective that lent both authority and emotional weight to his presentation. The courtroom listened as Edward unveiled more personal evidence, handwritten notes and private letters that hinted at a network of influence and subtle manipulation. These documents, he argued, suggested that Camilla had not merely observed the media frenzy from a distance, but had engaged in actions designed to ensure that Diana's every step was tracked and reported. Edward presented the letters carefully, reading passages aloud that implied coordination without explicitly stating culpability, leaving the courtroom to grapple with the inferences and implications. The effect was a delicate balance between accusation and evidence, a nuanced narrative that demanded both attention and reflection. As he progressed, Edward highlighted inconsistencies in prior testimonies, contradictions that, when paired with the physical evidence, painted a more troubling picture. Witness statements, public records, and internal communications were juxtaposed, revealing gaps and discrepancies that Edward suggested were more than coincidence. Each revelation was strategically timed, allowing the emotional resonance to build incrementally, like a carefully choreographed crescendo. The courtroom absorbed each new layer, the tension mounting as the narrative became increasingly compelling, the allegations more vivid, and the stakes ever higher. Throughout the session, the emotional undertone was unmistakable. Edward spoke with the precision of a legal advocate, but infused with the unmistakable cadence of personal grief and indignation. The human element of the story was ever present, transforming what could have been a sterile examination of documents into a narrative that resonated deeply. The audience was not merely observing evidence. They were witnessing a personal reckoning, a confrontation with a past that had been shrouded in secrecy and speculation. Every detail, every photograph, every correspondence became a brushstroke in a portrait of a night that had ended in tragedy but was now being re-examined under a relentless and unforgiving light. The chapter drew to a close with the presentation of a final piece of evidence, video footage that, when played, revealed the intersection of paparazzi pursuit and Diana's movements with startling clarity. The video, carefully analyzed frame by frame, captured moments that suggested intentional coordination, moments that Edward framed as critical to understanding the tragic sequence of events. The courtroom fell silent as the images played, the emotional weight of the visual evidence leaving little room for disbelief or dismissal. Camilla's composure, already strained, appeared to falter further, her hands resting tensely on her lap, her eyes betraying the apprehension that words alone could not convey. By the end of the chapter, the foundation of Edward's argument had been firmly established. The evidence unveiled was both meticulous and damning, creating a framework for the subsequent chapters that would explore motives, relationships, and the wider consequences of the revelations. The courtroom, still heavy with the gravity of what had been presented, seemed to pause in collective reflection, the world outside holding its breath for the next act in a drama that promised to reshape the understanding of a night that had haunted generations. The tension in the royal residence was palpable long before Edward arrived to confront Camilla formally. Whispers had circulated through the corridors for weeks, subtle hints of unease that no one dared speak aloud. Courtiers, long accustomed to maintaining the delicate equilibrium of the monarchy, now sensed a disruption, a crack in the facade that had so carefully projected unity and decorum. Inside the drawing room, Camilla sat rigidly on an ornate settee, her fingers intertwined in a deliberate attempt to maintain control over the storm she knew was approaching. She had long navigated the treacherous waters of public scrutiny, but this confrontation, initiated by a member of the royal family armed with evidence she could not easily dismiss, represented a different challenge entirely. A collision of private accountability and public revelation that threatened to unravel years of careful positioning. Edward entered with measured steps, his presence commanding yet understated, exuding a quiet authority that contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. As he closed the door behind him, the atmosphere seemed to thicken, each tick of the antique clock amplifying the weight of what was about to transpire. He carried no documents this time, no photographs or letters. Today was a personal confrontation, a reckoning in the intimate spaces where family dynamics could no longer be mediated by legal or public channels. His gaze met Camilla's, a silent exchange conveying the gravity of the encounter before a single word was spoken. He began with deliberate calm, recounting events with a clarity that left no room for evasion. He spoke of Diana's life, of the relentless media attention she endured, and the way in which her movements had been monitored and reported with surgical precision. His voice, steady yet edged with emotion, transformed each factual recollection into a narrative that was impossible to ignore. Camilla's attempts at composure were visible. She maintained her posture, but the slight tightening of her jaw and the brief flicker of unease in her eyes betrayed the internal struggle of someone confronted with allegations that pierced both public perception and private conscience. Edward's words were unrelenting, each assertion backed by the evidence he had painstakingly collected. He described the photographs, emails, and intercepted communications that suggested a flow of information from within the royal circle to those who tracked Diana's every move. He recounted travel logs and audio recordings, framing them not merely as artifacts of bureaucratic documentation, but as threads in a deliberate tapestry of surveillance. Camilla listened, her silence heavy with tension, understanding that each detail Edward revealed was a building block in an argument that implicated her in a narrative she could neither ignore nor easily refute. The conversation shifted from evidence to motive, a delicate exploration of why someone might engage in actions that endangered a life so publicly cherished. Edward framed his questions not as accusations alone, but as inquiries into the moral and ethical calculus behind decisions that had far-reaching consequences. Why would someone risk so much for attention or positioning? He asked, his tone measured but piercing. The question lingered in the air, an unspoken challenge that demanded introspection. Camilla's response was carefully measured, but the cracks in her controlled demeanor became more apparent, subtle gestures betraying discomfort as she navigated a landscape of moral ambiguity and familial confrontation. As the confrontation deepened, the emotional stakes intensified. Edward recounted personal anecdotes, moments of shared family history that underscored the gravity of the situation. He invoked memories of Diana, her kindness, her struggles, and her enduring impact on the family, framing the evidence within a context that was both intimate and universally compelling. The narrative was designed to resonate not only on a factual level but emotionally, challenging Camilla to reconcile the reality of her actions with the idealized image of family loyalty and responsibility. The juxtaposition of hard evidence and human emotion created a charged atmosphere, one in which reason and feeling collided, leaving neither participant untouched. The confrontation extended beyond words into the realm of visual impact. Edward produced a carefully curated selection of media coverage, juxtaposing images of Diana during her final days with the timing and placement of paparazzi that had captured her movements. The alignment of these images with prior evidence was stark, a visual demonstration that reinforced the narrative of intentional oversight. Camilla's reactions, observed by Edward with an analytical intensity, ranged from slight shifts in posture to moments of near-visible disbelief. Each visual revelation was another layer in the confrontation, creating a multidimensional argument that combined evidence, emotion, and ethical scrutiny. Intermittently, Edward paused to allow the weight of each revelation to settle, knowing that the confrontation was as much about psychological pressure as it was about factual presentation. The pauses were deliberate, creating a rhythm that forced Camilla to confront each point individually, to absorb the implications without the distraction of rapid progression. The silence was punctuated only by the subtle sounds of the room, the quiet rustling of documents, the ticking of the clock, the occasional intake of breath. In these moments, the confrontation transcended mere dialogue, becoming a psychological landscape where accountability, guilt, and familial expectation intertwined. Edward's narrative gradually expanded to include the wider consequences of the alleged coordination. He spoke of public perception, the impact on Diana's legacy, and the reverberations through the monarchy. The confrontation was no longer a private matter. It was a reckoning that bridged the private and public spheres, demonstrating how individual decisions could ripple outward, influencing narratives that shaped the perceptions of millions. Camilla, seated across from him, now faced the dual weight of personal accountability and public scrutiny, a convergence that intensified the emotional gravity of the encounter. As the dialogue progressed, Edward introduced hypothetical scenarios, asking Camilla to consider alternate outcomes and the ramifications of different choices. What if Diana had known the extent of surveillance, he asked. What if the patterns we now see had been visible to her in real time? These questions were not merely rhetorical. They were designed to elicit reflection and confrontation with moral responsibility. The hypothetical framing allowed Edward to highlight the consequences of actions indirectly, forcing Camilla to engage with the ethical dimensions of her decisions without overt accusation. The climax of the confrontation approached as Edward recounted the night in Paris with unflinching detail. He described the sequence of movements, the alignment of photographers, and the tragic culmination that resulted in Diana's fatal crash. Each step was presented as a narrative puzzle, with Camilla's alleged coordination serving as a pivotal piece. The tension in the room became almost tangible, a mixture of grief, anger, and disbelief that underscored the emotional intensity of the confrontation. Edward's delivery was precise, each word chosen to convey the gravity of the situation while maintaining the measured tone of someone deeply invested in truth and justice. By the conclusion of the confrontation, the emotional landscape of the room had shifted dramatically. Camilla, previously composed, now exhibited subtle signs of strain, slight tremors in her hands, the downward tilt of her head, the occasional tightening of lips, all indicative of the impact of Edward's narrative and the weight of evidence. Edward himself remained composed, but the emotional resonance of the encounter was undeniable, leaving both participants and observers acutely aware of the profound personal and familial stakes involved. The confrontation had not resolved the underlying issues, but it had illuminated them, bringing hidden tensions, ethical dilemmas, and emotional truths into the open with unflinching clarity. The moment the news of Edward's confrontation with Camilla reached the public, the world seemed to pause, collectively holding its breath as headlines splashed across newspapers, television screens, and digital platforms. The story of Camilla's alleged coordination with paparazzi on the night of Diana's fatal crash ignited an unprecedented media frenzy. Every outlet, from the most prestigious newspapers in London to the global tabloid circuits, sought to dissect, analyze, and sensationalize the revelations. The sheer intensity of public interest reflected not only the gravity of the allegations, but also the enduring fascination with Diana's life and the enduring mythos surrounding her tragic death. For the public, this was not just another royal scandal. It was a shocking re-examination of one of the most emotionally charged moments in recent history. Social media platforms became battlegrounds of opinion almost instantly. Millions of users took to Twitter, Instagram, and emerging video platforms, debating, defending, condemning, and theorizing about the events that Edward had disclosed. The hashtags related to the confrontation trended worldwide within hours, and live streams of news coverage garnered unprecedented viewership. Memes, videos, and speculative commentary proliferated, blending fact with conjecture, as users tried to grapple with the complex mix of family betrayal, ethical questions, and historical tragedy. Comment sections filled with heated arguments, tears, and outrage, each post a microcosm of the collective struggle to reconcile the royal family's private lives with their public responsibilities. News outlets, both mainstream and fringe, raced to obtain additional sources, contacts, and insider perspectives to validate Edward's revelations. Pundits and commentators dissected the documents and evidence, analyzing travel logs, paparazzi footage, and snippets of communication that Edward had referred to in his confrontation. Television anchors interviewed former palace aides, royal correspondents, and ethical experts, each attempting to contextualize the alleged coordination within a framework of morality, legality, and public accountability. Every expert opinion added layers to the narrative, often intensifying the outrage and confusion surrounding Camilla's role. Public sentiment was volatile and multifaceted. Some expressed profound anger, accusing Camilla of moral and ethical negligence that contributed to Diana's death. Others approached the situation with skepticism, demanding rigorous evidence before passing judgment on a figure long vilified in tabloids but historically shielded by palace discretion. Yet a third faction adopted a more reflective stance, contemplating the systemic pressures within the royal institution that might have incentivized or necessitated clandestine communication with media sources. Polls conducted by independent agencies revealed deep divisions, with a significant portion of the public expressing disbelief, disappointment, and a sense of betrayal, while others questioned the motives behind Edward's disclosure, wondering whether it was fueled by personal grievance, familial loyalty, or a genuine pursuit of justice. Amidst this whirlwind, the paparazzi themselves were thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight. Journalists who had chased Diana through Paris decades earlier were interviewed, some reluctantly recalling their experiences and interactions with palace sources. Certain photographs were re-examined frame by frame, with analysts noting patterns in timing and movement that lent credence, or, in some interpretations, ambiguity, to the notion that information had been selectively shared. The media's role, once peripheral in Edward's confrontation, became central, highlighting the symbiotic yet often adversarial relationship between royalty and the press, a dynamic fraught with ethical complexity and historical significance. Camilla's public relations team, previously meticulous in managing every public statement, now faced an overwhelming challenge. Internal meetings, recorded by some leaks, revealed a strategy focused on damage control, with attempts to frame the confrontation as a private family matter blown out of proportion by media sensationalism. Spokespeople issued statements emphasizing Camilla's long-standing charitable work, her commitment to the monarchy, and her desire to move forward without further public scrutiny. However, the effectiveness of such statements was limited. The narrative had already escaped the controlled corridors of palace communication, fueled by Edward's direct intervention and the public's emotional investment. International reaction added another layer of intensity. Foreign media outlets, from Paris to New York to Sydney, amplified the story, drawing connections to Diana's enduring global legacy and the worldwide fascination with the British royal family. In Paris, where Diana's life had tragically ended, journalists revisited the locations, interviewing witnesses, historians, and local officials. The narrative of coordinated paparazzi activity, previously confined to speculation and rumor, was now framed as a concrete allegation with potential historical and legal ramifications. Every mention of the events evoked visceral responses from audiences who had followed Diana's life, amplifying the emotional stakes and cultural resonance of the revelations. Within the United Kingdom, political figures and royal commentators were compelled to weigh in. Members of Parliament debated the broader implications of the accusations, particularly regarding the transparency and accountability of the monarchy in the modern era. Ethical questions arose. Could such coordination, if proven, constitute a breach of moral or legal responsibility? What mechanisms, if any, existed to hold members of the royal family accountable for actions that occurred behind closed doors but had public consequences? These discussions, broadcast and streamed widely, brought historical decisions into contemporary scrutiny, creating an environment in which past actions were evaluated under current ethical standards and societal expectations. The public's emotional response was not limited to anger or outrage. Mourning, nostalgia, and grief resurfaced as discussions of Diana's death intertwined with Edward's revelations. For many, the confrontation rekindled memories of the collective sorrow felt during the aftermath of the crash, amplifying the sense of betrayal implied by alleged internal coordination. Support networks, both in formal counseling and informal online communities, were inundated with individuals seeking to process the resurgence of emotions associated with Diana's story. The intensity of the reaction highlighted the enduring power of royal narratives to evoke deep personal and communal sentiment, a phenomenon that Edward's revelations had reignited with unprecedented force. Amid the chaos of public opinion, internal palace dynamics were equally fraught. Courtiers, advisors, and senior family members worked frantically to manage both the narrative and the optics of the unfolding scandal. Meetings were held in private chambers to assess potential legal ramifications, the impact on ongoing charitable initiatives, and the long-term consequences for the monarchy's reputation. Decisions regarding public appearances, scheduled events, and statements were scrutinized for their ability to mitigate or exacerbate the growing storm. The interplay between internal strategy and external perception became a delicate balancing act, where every word and gesture carried immense weight and consequence. The media frenzy was amplified by the emergence of leaked footage and audio from Edward's confrontation. Clips circulated online showing fragments of the exchange, each snippet generating commentary, debate, and speculation. Viewers dissected gestures, tone, and choice of words, constructing narratives that often extended beyond the verified facts. Conspiracy theories mingled with documented evidence, creating a complex ecosystem of belief and skepticism in which truth, perception, and speculation were intertwined. Social media algorithms magnified the most sensational and emotionally charged content, ensuring that the narrative reached audiences worldwide within hours. The emotional impact on Camilla was visible to the public as the media coverage intensified. Paparazzi captured images of her leaving private residences, her face a study in controlled anxiety, eyes shadowed with the strain of relentless scrutiny. These photographs, juxtaposed with archival images of Diana, created stark visual contrasts that further fueled public commentary. Analysts and commentators debated body language and emotional expression, interpreting subtle cues as indicators of guilt, remorse, or simply the stress of enduring a public reckoning. The human element of her response became a focal point, illustrating the complex interplay between individual psychology and public spectacle. Simultaneously, charitable organizations and public institutions associated with the royal family experienced heightened attention. Donors, partners, and beneficiaries sought clarity regarding Camilla's involvement and the potential implications for ongoing initiatives. Media inquiries into the continuity of philanthropic work underscored the broader societal impact of the allegations, highlighting how private actions of prominent individuals reverberated through networks of public service and civic engagement. The intersection of scandal, morality, and societal responsibility became a focal point of discourse, illustrating the multifaceted consequences of Edward's revelations. By the end of the first week of coverage, the media landscape had transformed entirely. What began as a private family confrontation had erupted into a global conversation encompassing historical investigation, ethical debate, emotional reckoning, and institutional scrutiny. Public engagement reached levels rarely seen in modern times, with the story dominating headlines, social feeds, and discussion forums. Edward's decision to confront Camilla in a direct and evidence-driven manner had catalyzed a cascade of events that reshaped the public understanding of both Diana's legacy and Camilla's role within the monarchy. The narrative was no longer confined to family corridors or palace walls. It had become a global spectacle, reflecting the enduring power of storytelling, reputation, and human emotion. As the public outcry reached a fever pitch, the royal legal apparatus sprang into action with unprecedented urgency. The confrontation between Prince Edward and Queen Camilla, once considered a private and internal family matter, had exploded into a high-stakes legal and institutional crisis. Legal teams, advisors, and palace strategists convened in emergency meetings to assess the immediate and long-term implications of Edward's accusations. Every detail, from the documents Edward produced to the potential media interpretations, was scrutinized meticulously. This was no ordinary court dispute. It was a maelstrom that combined historical allegations, the potential for criminal scrutiny, civil liability, and the intense glare of global public attention. The palace could no longer operate in the shadows. Every step would be visible, dissected, and critiqued in real time. From the moment Edward's allegations became public, legal counsel began reviewing the evidence in a forensic and strategic manner. Lawyers pored over travel logs, communication records, and eyewitness accounts, cross-referencing each piece of data to establish authenticity and corroborate timelines. Questions were raised regarding the admissibility of evidence, the potential for defamation claims, and the risk of civil suits initiated by paparazzi or other third parties. Legal experts debated the plausibility of proving that Camilla had knowingly coordinated with the media on the night of Diana's fatal crash, weighing historical distance against documentary proof and personal testimony. Every nuance mattered, from a single email timestamp to a fleeting recollection of a photographer present in Paris, as each element could tip the balance of legal interpretation and public perception. Meanwhile, Camilla's legal team moved swiftly to construct a defensive framework aimed at mitigating reputational damage while preserving institutional stability. Their strategy involved a combination of legal maneuvers, media messaging, and internal palace coordination. Court filings emphasized the private nature of family disputes, seeking to frame Edward's claims as motivated by personal grievance rather than incontrovertible evidence. Media statements stressed Camilla's decades of public service and philanthropic contributions, attempting to humanize her in the face of allegations that carried potentially criminal implications. Public appearances were carefully curated, with her demeanor calibrated to convey composure and dignity under pressure, while avoiding statements that could be construed as admissions of guilt. As lawyers and strategists worked behind closed doors, Edward began to marshal his own support network. Advocates, former palace aides, and historical witnesses were contacted to provide corroborating testimony and context for the allegations. His team compiled exhaustive reports and timelines to demonstrate patterns that suggested intentional coordination with paparazzi, aiming to reinforce the credibility of the claims and withstand both legal scrutiny and media interrogation. This meticulous approach reflected Edward's understanding of the stakes. He was challenging not just an individual within the family, but the very structures of secrecy and control that had historically shielded palace affairs from public examination. The escalation into formal legal proceedings introduced a new dimension of complexity. Jurisdictional questions arose as the events in question spanned multiple countries, including the United Kingdom and France, and involved both domestic and international actors. Legal advisors debated which courts held authority, what evidence could be legally compelled, and how to navigate cross-border privacy protections. These logistical challenges compounded the emotional intensity of the situation, forcing all parties to operate with precision and caution while the public and media clamored for immediate answers. Palace maneuvering extended beyond legal strategy. Internally, senior members of the royal family faced difficult choices regarding loyalty, discretion, and the potential fallout of taking sides. Courtiers managed communications between family members, attempting to prevent leaks, reduce misinterpretation, and maintain a semblance of stability in the midst of a growing storm. The palace press office operated at peak intensity, monitoring social media trends, international news coverage, and public opinion metrics to anticipate potential crises and craft responsive messaging. Every press release, photo opportunity, and statement was considered for its ability to influence the narrative, prevent misrepresentation, and protect institutional integrity. The broader legal community observed the unfolding drama with intense interest. Barristers, solicitors, and scholars analyzed the potential ramifications for both criminal and civil liability, considering questions of negligence, complicity, and ethical responsibility. Legal forums and publications debated whether palace immunity, historical precedent, or institutional privilege could shield Camilla from scrutiny. Hypothetical scenarios circulated. If coordination with paparazzi were proven, what legal consequences might arise decades after the event? Could claims of aiding and abetting public endangerment hold weight in court? These discussions underscored the unprecedented nature of the confrontation and the complex interplay between legal accountability and royal prerogative. Simultaneously, the palace faced a delicate balancing act regarding public perception. Every maneuver, from courtroom filings to media statements, was designed to manage optics as much as to address substantive legal questions. Advisors emphasized the importance of maintaining the monarchy's reputation, even while navigating allegations that touched on one of the most emotionally charged events in recent royal history. Internal discussions weighed whether transparency might mitigate public outrage or exacerbate it, as revelations could inflame emotions and create new avenues for speculation. The challenge was to act decisively while maintaining the appearance of dignity, discretion, and measured authority. The media, meanwhile, had intensified its coverage of the legal escalation. Investigative journalists dissected the evidence Edward presented, often obtaining independent verification or seeking additional commentary from former palace aides and historical witnesses. Television broadcasts featured panels of legal and royal experts debating the strength of Edward's case, the possible defenses available to Camilla, and the broader implications for the monarchy. Newspapers published in-depth features exploring historical context, previous scandals, and the ethical responsibilities of royal figures. Public fascination was further amplified by the tension between legal procedure, moral judgment, and the enduring emotional resonance of Diana's death. Edward's legal strategy also included a psychological dimension, emphasizing the moral urgency of his revelations. By highlighting the potential consequences of Camilla's alleged coordination, he framed the case as an ethical imperative rather than merely a familial dispute. His team presented evidence not only in a factual sense, but as a narrative that conveyed the stakes, the impact on Diana's memory, the consequences for public trust, and the precedent set for accountability within royal circles. This approach resonated with the public and media, reinforcing the perception that Edward's confrontation was a necessary act of truth-seeking and moral responsibility. In parallel, Camilla's advisors prepared contingency plans for every possible outcome. Legal teams assessed the likelihood of settlement versus extended litigation, including strategies to limit exposure, manage witness testimony, and control the flow of information to the press. Security protocols were adjusted, anticipating increased public attention, potential protests, and the risk of confrontational encounters with media representatives. Every detail, from courtroom seating arrangements to travel routes, was meticulously planned to minimize vulnerability while preserving dignity. The stakes were amplified by the historical context of Diana's legacy. The tragic events in Paris had remained a subject of intense public fascination, and Edward's revelations reframed the narrative in a way that challenged long-standing assumptions. Historians, royal commentators, and ethical analysts weighed in, considering the implications of alleged coordination with paparazzi in both legal and moral terms. The debate encompassed not only Camilla's role but also the broader responsibility of the royal institution to protect individuals in the public eye and the enduring consequences of secrecy and selective disclosure. As the legal battle unfolded, pressure mounted on all sides to demonstrate competence, integrity, and foresight. Edward's team continued to gather evidence, interview witnesses, and refine their strategy, aware that public perception could influence judicial outcomes indirectly through societal expectations and political pressure. Camilla's advisors worked to anticipate and counter these moves, balancing defensive strategy with proactive public relations. The palace itself had to navigate an intricate web of internal loyalty, external scrutiny, and historical accountability, ensuring that every decision reinforced both institutional authority and personal credibility. The courtroom became a stage on which not only legal arguments but also historical grievances and emotional reckonings played out. Testimonies were scrutinized for both content and delivery, with body language, tone, and emotional cues analyzed by both media and public. Every objection, admission, and cross-examination carried weight far beyond the immediate legal implications, influencing public sentiment and shaping the narrative of royal responsibility. Edward's meticulous presentation of evidence and ethical framing forced Camilla and her team to respond with equal rigor, blending legal acumen with strategic communication under the unrelenting spotlight of global attention. Throughout this period, the palace maneuvered carefully to maintain operational continuity. Charitable engagements, public appearances, and internal administration had to continue despite the legal and media maelstrom. Advisors emphasized the importance of projecting stability, even as the internal dynamics were fraught with tension, uncertainty, and emotional strain. The ability to conduct routine functions while managing an extraordinary crisis became a measure of the monarchy's resilience and adaptability in the face of unprecedented scrutiny. By the close of the first month of the legal escalation, the situation had evolved from a private confrontation into a fully public, high-stakes contest involving legal, ethical, and historical dimensions. The interplay between Edward's revelations, Camilla's defensive measures, and the palace's strategic positioning had created a complex, multi-layered narrative that engaged the public, media, and international observers. The legal battle was no longer a matter of isolated family disagreement. It had become a defining episode in the history of the modern monarchy, highlighting the tension between secrecy, accountability, and the relentless public gaze. The courtroom grew tense as the first wave of palace staff were called to give testimony, their presence a silent acknowledgement that decades of secrecy could no longer be shielded behind gilded walls. Former aides, chauffeurs, and administrative assistants entered with carefully measured steps, aware that their words could shift the course of the trial, reshape public perception, and potentially implicate one of the most powerful figures in the monarchy. Cameras outside captured fleeting glimpses of nervous glances and whispered exchanges, feeding a media frenzy that had reached unprecedented levels. Every step taken into the courtroom carried both literal and symbolic weight. It was not just a legal proceeding, but a public reckoning with the hidden machinery of the royal household. The first witness, a former personal assistant to Camilla, recounted her experiences with meticulous detail. She described patterns of unusual communication during high-profile events, recalling evenings where Camilla had scheduled meetings with individuals who were later identified as freelance paparazzi. These meetings were presented as casual, social encounters, but in hindsight, they raised troubling questions about intent and awareness. The assistant's voice, measured yet tinged with underlying tension, recounted instances where specific travel plans and private appearances were shared informally with those outside the palace, blurring the line between courtesy and strategic exposure. The courtroom was silent, absorbing the weight of her words, each statement punctuating the growing narrative that Edward had meticulously laid out. Another witness, a former security officer, provided testimony that sent ripples through the proceedings. He described logistical anomalies on the night of Diana's fatal accident, recalling unusual leniencies in protocols that had otherwise been strictly enforced. Certain routes, ordinarily closed off to the public and media, had been left accessible, while communications indicated prior awareness of paparazzi positioning. The officer's account suggested coordination beyond mere coincidence, aligning with Edward's assertions that Diana's movements were unusually exposed that evening. Every detail, from the timing of police checkpoints to the deployment of bodyguards, was recounted with precision, creating a narrative that made observers question the standard practices of palace operations and whether those practices had been manipulated intentionally. The testimonies were not limited to logistical accounts. Emotional and interpersonal dynamics were also brought to the forefront. A former chef, who had served at multiple royal residences, shared recollections of overheard conversations and cryptic remarks made during dinners and late-night gatherings. Though casual in tone, these remarks hinted at a deeper awareness of Diana's schedule and vulnerabilities. Witnesses described Camilla as unusually inquisitive about Diana's whereabouts and her interactions with media figures. While these accounts did not offer direct proof of criminal intent, the cumulative effect created a tapestry of circumstantial evidence suggesting premeditation, or at least a conscious disregard for the consequences of public exposure. As the testimonies progressed, patterns emerged that painted a picture of institutional complexity intersecting with personal ambition. Witnesses described a hierarchical communication network in which messages about Diana's appearances and movements were relayed up the chain of command, often passing through informal channels that bypassed traditional oversight. Certain staff members, initially hesitant to share their experiences, revealed that they had been instructed to prioritize discretion over transparency. The narrative conveyed a palace environment in which secrecy was embedded in daily operations, yet where select individuals might have had the power to influence exposure for personal or political objectives. The courtroom absorbed these revelations with a mix of shock and curiosity, each story layering nuance onto Edward's broader allegations. Media experts later analyzed the testimonies and noted the significance of the minutiae described by staff. Tiny details, such as the timing of a phone call, the unusual presence of a photographer, or the subtle redirection of staff responsibilities, were elevated from mundane operational notes to critical puzzle pieces. In aggregate, these seemingly minor points constructed a compelling narrative of potential complicity. Analysts debated the veracity of memory versus the power of corroboration, acknowledging that multiple witnesses independently noting similar patterns added credibility. Edward's legal strategy, it appeared, was succeeding not through dramatic single revelations, but by creating a dense web of supporting accounts, each reinforcing the broader argument of deliberate exposure. The emotional toll on witnesses was palpable. Many had devoted years of loyalty to the royal household and were now thrust into a spotlight that demanded candor, often at the expense of personal and professional relationships. Testimonies were delivered with a mix of regret, caution, and moral urgency. Some witnesses expressed relief at finally speaking openly, while others conveyed fear about potential backlash from the institution they had served. This tension underscored a critical element of the trial, the human dimension. Beyond the legal arguments, beyond the documentation and timelines, the testimony of individuals who had lived within the palace walls revealed the weight of moral conflict, secrecy, and the enduring consequences of decisions made in private corridors decades ago. Edward's legal team skillfully guided witnesses to contextualize their experiences, framing observations not as isolated incidents, but as part of a systematic pattern that aligned with his central claim. Each account, whether logistical, anecdotal, or observational, was used to reinforce the theory that Camilla's knowledge and possible coordination with media were not sporadic but intentional. Cross-examinations sought to anticipate defensive arguments, preemptively addressing potential claims of misunderstanding or misremembering events. By maintaining a balance between factual recitation and narrative coherence, Edwards' team strengthened the overall impact of the testimonies, ensuring they were both credible and compelling to the court and public alike. The accumulation of testimony also intensified media scrutiny. Headlines captured the most sensational aspects, while deeper analytical pieces examined the operational mechanics revealed in court. Commentators dissected palace communication hierarchies, security protocols, and media interactions, often highlighting contradictions or gaps that bolstered Edwards' narrative. Public engagement soared, with social media platforms erupting with discussion, debate, and speculation. The palace faced the dual challenge of managing both internal legal defense and external reputational damage, as the testimonies illuminated aspects of royal operations previously shielded from scrutiny. Importantly, these accounts also introduced new questions about accountability, ethics, and institutional culture. If coordination or facilitation of media exposure occurred, what responsibility rested with Camilla, with the broader palace staff, and with the monarchy itself? How could decades of secrecy intersect with personal ambition to create outcomes of such profound consequence? Observers debated whether historical distance diminished liability or whether moral and institutional responsibility remained pressing. The courtroom became a forum not only for legal adjudication, but for societal reflection on power, privilege, and ethical obligations within elite institutions. The most dramatic moments of testimony came when former aides recounted direct interactions with Camilla, in which her questions and statements indicated a preoccupation with Diana's movements. These anecdotes were detailed and vivid, providing a window into the interplay between personal curiosity, competitive tension, and institutional dynamics. Witnesses described situations where Camilla's interest in Diana's location was unusually pointed, coupled with knowledge of media contacts that would later appear near Diana's vehicle on the night of the fatal accident. Each story, though circumstantial in isolation, contributed to a mounting perception of intentional exposure, reinforcing Edwards' broader argument and intensifying the moral and emotional stakes of the trial. By the close of the week, the collective testimony of palace staff had fundamentally reshaped the courtroom narrative. What began as a confrontation framed by Edward as a familial dispute had evolved into a multifaceted revelation of operational patterns, ethical ambiguities, and potential complicity. The weight of first-hand accounts lent credibility and texture to Edward's allegations, amplifying the emotional impact and underscoring the broader implications for both Camilla personally and the monarchy institutionally. Public reaction was polarized. Some expressed outrage and demanded accountability, while others cautioned that memory and interpretation might complicate legal and moral conclusions. Yet universally, the testimonies injected an undeniable tension, urgency, and human complexity into a trial that had already captured the world's attention. The morning light filtered into the courtroom, casting long shadows across the polished oak floors as the next witnesses were called. This chapter of the trial promised to be explosive, as it involved those who had, for decades, captured the world's most invasive images of Diana, the paparazzi. These men and women, once operating with near-complete impunity, were now testifying under oath, and for the first time, their words carried potential consequences that went beyond fines or fleeting scandal. They arrived cautiously, aware that any misstatement could reignite public outrage, implicate them legally, and tarnish their professional reputations permanently. Cameras outside swarmed as the doors opened, and reporters jostled to capture even the briefest glimpse of figures who had haunted Diana's life, some of whom were now visibly anxious about the truth they were about to reveal. The first to speak was a photographer who had spent years covering European high society, often specializing in royal assignments. He described a network of coordination among paparazzi, sharing tips and updates on Diana's movements, as if they were part of a covert intelligence operation rather than the work of freelance media professionals. Details that had previously seemed coincidental. A photographer being at a specific location at precisely the right time, multiple cameras snapping simultaneously, and the uncanny timing of photos released in tabloid publications, were now recast as evidence of systematic planning. He admitted that, on multiple occasions, certain royal staff had provided indirect hints, offhand remarks, or subtle cues that gave photographers an edge in predicting Diana's schedule. His admission, carefully articulated, sent a ripple through the courtroom, confirming that the media's intrusion was facilitated by insiders within the royal household. The intensity rose when the discussion turned to the night of Diana's fatal accident. Witnesses described an unusual convergence of photographers along the Pont de l'Alma tunnel and surrounding streets, noting how the volume of cameras and vehicles in pursuit far exceeded what was typical for any high-profile movement. One photographer confessed that there had been prior knowledge of Diana's route, timing, and even the car she would be traveling in. These insights were allegedly passed along through informal palace channels, creating a dangerous opportunity for paparazzi to track her movements aggressively. Under cross-examination, the witness acknowledged the ethical ambiguity of their actions but framed them as opportunistic rather than criminal, though he admitted that hindsight painted a far more sinister picture than the thrill of chasing a story had suggested at the time. Another witness, who had coordinated photo distribution for international tabloids, revealed the existence of a near-instantaneous information relay among paparazzi teams. He explained how mobile communications, previously considered cutting-edge for personal use, had been weaponized to track Diana in real time. Each message, tip, or location update was a node in a complex network, which allowed photographers to anticipate her every move. When questioned about whether these communications ever involved palace staff, he hesitated, visibly uncomfortable, before admitting that in at least 3 instances, remarks made by individuals in proximity to Camilla's circle had significantly enhanced their ability to track her. These admissions lent credence to Edward's claim that Camilla had not only been aware of media activity, but had potentially contributed to the circumstances that led to the fatal chase. The testimonies were not solely focused on logistics. They also shed light on the culture of intimidation and fear that accompanied Diana's constant surveillance. Paparazzi recounted the aggressive tactics often employed to secure the perfect shot. High-speed chases, sudden braking to force photo opportunities, and relentless tailing through congested city streets. They described a tacit understanding that the value of these photographs was measured not just in monetary gain, but in social prestige, competitive reputation, and the ability to influence public perception. The environment created a perfect storm where curiosity, ambition, and moral compromise intertwined, placing Diana in an extraordinarily vulnerable position. The courtroom audience could almost feel the tension, the roar of engines, and the flash of cameras that defined those final hours in Paris. The narrative took a darker turn when a senior photographer admitted to knowing about private arrangements orchestrated by palace insiders. He recalled specific instructions, such as subtle hints dropped during public events or whispered comments about Diana's preferred dining spots, which were then interpreted as opportunities to obtain exclusive images. The witness recounted how such information led directly to strategic positioning along Diana's travel routes, ensuring that photographers would intercept her at critical moments. The cumulative effect, he conceded, was an environment where every public move was potentially monitored, manipulated, and exploited. The testimony suggested that the fatal pursuit on the night of the accident was not an isolated incident of reckless driving, but the culmination of a systematic pattern of exposure facilitated by those with inside knowledge. Edward's legal team seized on these confessions to highlight a chilling reality. The combination of palace facilitation and aggressive media tactics created conditions in which tragedy became almost inevitable. They presented a timeline mapping Diana's movements against the positions of paparazzi vehicles, demonstrating a near-perfect alignment that, according to expert analysis, was statistically improbable without insider coordination. Questions raised by Edward's attorneys challenged the notion of mere coincidence, pointing to repeated patterns, corroborating witness accounts, and internal communications that implied a deliberate orchestration of access and exposure. The courtroom followed the evidence closely, recognizing the sophistication and gravity of the case being constructed. The psychological and emotional dimensions were also brought to light. Paparazzi testified about the intense pressure of maintaining exclusivity, the fear of missing a moment, and the adrenaline-fueled competition that had defined their careers. One photographer described the moral conflict of chasing Diana, admitting to private feelings of guilt and anxiety over the risk they posed to her safety. Another reflected on the decades-long professional culture that normalized invasion of privacy and glamorized dangerous pursuits, revealing a collective mindset that had inadvertently or deliberately endangered a vulnerable individual. These reflections humanized the perpetrators, demonstrating that even calculated actions were intertwined with human flaws, ambition, and societal pressures. For the public following the trial, these confessions were explosive. The world had long been aware of the paparazzi's relentless pursuit of Diana, but the revelation of potential insider assistance, coupled with strategic, real-time tracking, added an unprecedented layer of accountability and moral complexity. Journalists, commentators, and media analysts debated whether the ethical responsibility rested with the photographers, the palace insiders, or both. Some argued that decades of glamorized reporting and obsessive media coverage had desensitized professionals to the dangers, while others contended that deliberate facilitation crossed an indefensible line, transforming the paparazzi from opportunistic photographers into instruments of harm. The courtroom drama intensified as Edward's team introduced internal communications, purportedly from palace records, that suggested knowledge of the media's positioning. These messages, often cryptic, hinted at awareness of Diana's location and suggested a degree of coordination with external parties. Witnesses corroborated that such communications had been passed along informally, sometimes with subtle encouragement or tacit approval from individuals close to Camilla. The combination of first-hand confessions and documentary evidence built a compelling case that the fatal chase in Paris was not merely a tragic accident, but the outcome of a chain of calculated decisions and opportunistic behaviors intersecting at a critical moment. By the end of the day, the cumulative impact of the paparazzi testimonies was unmistakable. The narrative presented to the court depicted a complex web of exposure, ambition, and oversight failures that implicated not just those behind the cameras, but potentially those who had facilitated access. Edwards' claims that Camilla had been aware and possibly complicit gained a layer of tangible support, and the emotional resonance of the testimonies, the mix of fear, guilt, and retrospective realization, underscored the human cost of the events. The media outside framed the story in stark terms: a royal figure under scrutiny, a network of paparazzi revealing dark truths, and a tragedy whose full dimensions were only now being fully articulated. The chapter closed with a palpable sense of unease and tension. The testimonies had not only documented the mechanics of Diana's final hours, but had illuminated the dangerous convergence of human ambition, institutional secrecy, and media culture. Observers were left grappling with profound questions about responsibility, morality, and accountability, while Edwards' narrative gained momentum, portraying a scenario where calculated exposure and aggressive pursuit contributed to an avoidable loss. The courtroom, the media, and the public had witnessed confessions that were as emotionally charged as they were factually significant, setting the stage for the next wave of revelations in the ongoing trial.